Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here to talk about 5 off-grid ways to preserve food. So to be honest, the first 4 are ones I have done. The first 3 are the ones I do the most. And then the last one I'm bringing up is something I haven't done yet, but something you can look into because it can be a very viable way to preserve food where you don't have to depend on electricity. Now, this doesn't mean it's the end all. I just wanted to pick 5. So what I'm hoping that people will do, especially if they or maybe their grandparents or parents were experienced in these things, that they can share some more ideas in the comments down below. So the top one for me is the one I do the most nowadays is dehydrating. I actually started off canning and used to can a lot more foods than I do now. There are some things I've switched to dehydrating. However, how do you do this off grid? Yes, I do have electric dehydrators. And yes, I can run them off solar, but I'm not talking about that because I realize solar is a big thing, a big expense, and not everybody can afford that. However, there are many other ways that you can dehydrate without having to depend on electricity. In fact, a few years ago, I did a video where I compiled a whole bunch of different ideas on ways that other people have dehydrated foods totally off grid. So I'll be linking to that video down below, but most commonly what I do is during the winter months, I use our wood stove. So Patrick did build me a wood stove dehydrating rack. I'll also link to that video down below where he shows how we made it. And I actually have 2 of them now, and I stack them on top of each other. Initially started off with the one to set on top of the wood stove for doing things like beef jerky, things that can handle higher heat and so on, and you need it to dry faster. And then things that I don't want to dry that quickly or could be an issue putting up there, I dry next to the wood stove. And that works out really good for me for a whole bunch of things. Now, I have not really tried dehydrating much liquid stuff there, but I have dehydrated yogurt on using that method right next to the wood stove, and it dehydrated beautifully, and many other things. I plan on doing more experimentations using that with liquids as the winter goes on and we have plenty of fires going, and I'll keep you updated on that in some this and that videos. But also know that there are many other things that you can do. In the summertime, a lot of people can get away with just air and sun drying. Around here, it doesn't work so well for us because we get too much humidity and it can take way too long for things to dry. They can spoil or mold before they can fully dry. But I think certain things I could dry that way, like hanging. A lot of people talk about using paper bags. So like a brown paper bag, lunch bag kind of thing, put their herbs or whatever in there, hang them up. That keeps the dust and everything off. And I think the paper does also help pull some of the moisture out of the items as well as allow some airflow because, paper can be good for that. But I've used just old pillowcases to hang and dry my seeds with when I'm harvesting seeds and, just like cutting off whole stalks and putting them in the pillowcases and then letting the flowers and everything dry. Now that works for me pretty good. So, but I have to do that inside because it's going to be a little less humid in there. Sometimes I'll hang it in the sun if we're getting sun, and that does help, but that works for those. I've just tried other things and not been able to get them to fully dry, but I should probably do more experimenting with that as well. Okay, so now canning. How can you do canning off grid? Well, all of my canning I do off grid anyway. And it's not because we're fully off grid, because we're not. We're about 50-50 on the off grid thing. We depend on public power more in the winter time than we do in the summertime because of our, we get plenty of solar in the summertime, but not in the winter, especially where we're at. But anyway, when you're talking about canning produce from your own garden, yeah, that's usually happening in the summertime. So I prefer to do that outside where the heat stays outside, and I do that on a propane cooker. So it was one that came with a turkey fryer, but you can buy like propane stoves for outdoor that stand up higher than that. You can use rocket stoves And I know that Jano, when he used to be putting out videos, he was actually, I think, pressure canning using a rocket stove, but that's a little more tedious because you have to keep that pressure up. So you got to keep feeding that fire. Like, you got to stay on top of it. You have to stay on top of it anyway if you're water bath canning, but because you want to maintain the proper pressure, it can be a little trickier, but it can be done. You can also use open flame. I believe that Jamie was doing that on an open flame, doing a lot of canning and pressure canning on an open flame in their outdoor kitchen from An American Homestead. So you can probably go back and watch some of their older videos, and I think it shows her doing that. At least I thought I remember. The same thing applies, is just like with any heat source, when you're pressure canning, you got to really be paying attention to make sure that you're keeping that heat up. It's easier to do on an element or a propane that has a stove that has where you can adjust the heat setting, and usually you can get once you get the heat setting set, it's good, but on a fire, it can vary quite a bit, so you really got to keep up on it. But yes, you can do that. And if nothing else, you can definitely do water bath canning using those methods. So then fermenting. Fermenting is a great way of preserving food that requires no electricity at all. You don't even have to refrigerate it, even though I typically do refrigerate my kimchi and other such. You don't have to do that, because one of the main reasons you would ferment is so that you don't have to refrigerate it. But it would still be recommended you keep it in a cool area. I'll be talking about that after I finish going through this list. Now, I realize fermenting is not for everyone. Not everyone likes all their foods fermented. I don't like all my foods fermented either. Though I do ferment some garlic and onion every so often. The thing I don't like about that is it takes away the strong, powerful flavor of garlic and onion when you ferment it, but it is still a great way to have it preserved for using in various dishes, and I've done that. But for me, it's better either dehydrated or frozen and then used that way. Though freezing, I've learned, does kill off more of the nutrients than any other method, where fermenting is probably going to be the one that's going to preserve the most because it's fermented. Everything's still alive in there. Then number 4 would be pickling. Now, I've only done this a couple of times, but the great thing about pickling is just like with fermenting. In fact, fermenting was considered like the old-fashioned way of pickling, but it's a different type of pickling than using vinegar. So I'm talking about the modern-day pickling that requires the use of vinegar. And yes, I would use my homemade vinegar, but I would use it full strength just to be certain. Usually when you're pickling using like a store-bought vinegar of a 5% acidity, you're diluting it, where with homemade vinegar, you can get a 5% acidity. And if, like me, you keep pH strips on hand and you need to know how high that acidity is, having those universal pH strips can be helpful. You want a reading of 2.5 to 3.5 at the highest to get that acidity you need for canning. But still, I would just use full strength to be certain. But I haven't done that in a long time. I've pressure canned pickled beets where I used homemade vinegar. So the vinegar was more for the flavor, not for the preservation of it. So yes, pickling is a great off-grid way. You don't have to can the stuff once you've pickled it. The vinegar is going to preserve it. The 5th way, it's actually 2 methods that can go hand in hand, and these are methods I have yet to try, but they're very old methods, and that would be the salt cure and the smoking. Some people do both. They'll salt and then they'll smoke it. The smoking will preserve the meat, as will the salt. Typically it's used for meat, but it can be used for some vegetables and even fruits. So, smoking, you can just build yourself a smoker. It's just basically a little box where you would hang the meats, fruits, vegetables, and then obviously having plenty of salt on hand is going to be important if you're going to use salt curing. Salt is a great thing to stock up on anyway if you're into preparedness, because salt is necessary. It's necessary for so many things. I use it in my homemade laundry detergent and scouring powder. I use it obviously for cooking and baking and so much more. And it can be a great barter thing. So I highly recommend stocking up on salt, especially your healthier salts such as Himalayan salt, Redmond real salt, and so on. The last thing I want to talk about, I already covered the 5 ways, but let's talk a little bit about cold storage, especially for those of you who live in warmer climates where you don't have any place where you can keep things cold. Well, it would be a good idea, or cooler. It'd be a good idea to try to consider something that you can do that won't have to necessarily cost you a lot of money, where you can have a place that things can stay at a cooler temperature. I mean, the old-fashioned way was root cellars. That's where they kept all their carrots, and people still do this today. Carrots, onions, potatoes, any kind of root vegetable can get stuck in there. Even apples, squash, pumpkins, and more can be put into the cold storage without having to preserve them in any special way, and they could last for many months. So a root cellar obviously would be great. Around here, hardly anyone has anything like that because of our high amount of rain. There's very few basements even around here. There are some, but yeah, it's because of the rain that we get. It's just less common to find root cellars and basements in our area. But you can basically create your own root cellar by going to the dump and getting an old broken down freezer and burying that in the ground. You just need to make sure you have a way that it can be vented to the surface so it can have airflow in there. That will prevent things from rotting. But it can be a good way to store your ferments, your root vegetables, and anything else you would want to keep in a cooler climate. So that's one way. And then another old-fashioned way, like my father-in-law, when he was a kid living in North Carolina, that they had a spring house. They didn't have electricity, so they didn't have a refrigerator or freezer. So they had a spring house that they used to keep things cold during all year round. And you can learn more about that by checking that out. Obviously, you would have to have a spring nearby and you would have to build some kind of structure to make that work. And then don't forget, there's also ice houses and so much more. Again, this is going to require you live in an area where you can cut, and having the equipment and ability to cut chunks of ice out of your lakes and ponds and more during the winter time. And then insulating it, what they typically did was insulate it with straw, the layers of ice, insulate that with straw, so it'd actually take them through the whole summer before it was all melted, and then they would have to start all over again. But then they could keep their preserved goods or meats and whatever cold all through the year that way. So I suggest doing more research into any of these. I'm sure there's many more methods that you can look into that can keep items cool in your warmer places. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please share in comments down below any thoughts, ideas that you have, things that you've tried, things you know about, your favorite ways to do stuff, and specifically focused on anything that you can do off-grid to preserve your foods, because that will be helpful in the case of, for one, saving electricity, and for two, in the event of a long-term power outage and you need to be able to have a way to still keep putting up food. And by the way, don't forget to subscribe to my second channel, Rain Country 2, and my Rumble channel, which is always linked in the description box down below, just in case for some crazy reason this channel here disappears. You'll know where else you can find my video content. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.